Thank you everybody for joining us this evening. My name is Sarah Logan. I'm a lecturer here in the International Relations Department at the Bell School at the Australian National University. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respect to the elders past, present and emerging. The seminar we're here for this evening is the first in the Digital Politics of the Asia Pacific seminar series, hosted by Dr. Ross Tapsell, Graeme Smith and myself. In this series, we're delving into a number of pressing questions around the practice of digital politics in the Asia Pacific. Our next seminar in July is on the impact of tech in protest movements in Asia, and the one after that in September is on digital politics in India. So we hope you'll join us for those and for others. But on to this evening's event. A few housekeeping things. We'll be hosting a panel discussion for about 45 minutes this evening, followed by a Q&A. Please remember to keep your self on mute unless you're asking a question. On questions, this seminar will be recorded. So if you wish to ask a question but you don't want to be recorded, feel free to email Graeme Smith, who's moderating this event. His email address is graeme.smith, S-M-I-T-H, @anu.edu.au, and Graeme will ask it for you. So otherwise, if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to ask in the chat, which will be monitored, as well as by using the raised hand function on Zoom. So our panellists this evening are Assistant Professor Rogier Creemers from the University of Leiden, Associate Professor Angela Zhang from Hong Kong University, and John Lee from the Mercator Institute for China Studies. We're very lucky to have all three, and I'm extremely grateful to them all for making this work across multiple time zones and in very busy schedules. So thank you. I think we can look forward to a really stimulating discussion on shifts in the relationship between big tech and the Chinese party state. Our discussion this evening will be hosted by Dr. Graeme Smith of the Department of Pacific Affairs here at ANU and host of the Little Red podcast. So over to you, Graeme.
Great. Okay, well, I'll just get on with the show. So just to be upfront, we are recording this for the podcast, but we won't be recording the Q&A. So feel free to ask without any danger of your questions being used and abused on the interwebs. So I'll just get straight into the panel discussion with a bit of framing up front to give some background to what we're going to talk about today. Last month, China's State Administration of Market Regulation, a previously rather low-key regulatory agency, hit Alibaba with a whopping $2.8 billion fine for abusing its market dominance and forcing merchants to use only its e-commerce platforms. It hasn't been a great year for Alibaba, with authorities halting the IPO of its internet finance arm, Ant Group, in November last year. The $37 billion listing would have been the world's largest and could have led to a bank larger than any in China and the US. In April, we also found that Alibaba's Jack Ma wasn't the only tech billionaire in the party's sights. No fewer than 13 platform giants, including Tencent, ByteDance, food delivery platform Meituan, and rideshare company Didi, were all hauled in for a chat with the central bank and other regulators. While none of them had gone as far as Jack Ma in accusing China's state banks of having a pawn shop mentality, hefty fines and restructuring of their businesses are expected to follow over the coming year. All of this happened with a fair bit of drama. ByteDance's CEO and founder stood down before the much anticipated IPO of the company. And a couple of weeks ago, Meituan's CEO posted a controversial Tang Dynasty poem that read in part, quote, "It's just wishful thinking that Qin Shi Huang expects to rely on force to maintain his and his descendants' rule on China forever. The ashes in the pit haven't turned cold yet, but there are already riots in Shandong." Wang Xing later claimed that he was talking about his competitors, but nearly everyone assumed he was talking about Xi Jinping. The company's stock lost $30 billion. To unpack all of this, we're joined by Angela Zhang from the University of Hong Kong, the author of Chinese Antitrust Exceptionalism, as you can see in the background there, Rogier Creemers from Leiden University, and John Lee from the Mercator Institute of Chinese Studies. So first, a quick question for you all. What does the Chinese government hope to achieve by going after these tech giants? Angela, you first.
Well, in the media, this has been depicted as like a way for the Chinese government to control its tech giants, given their outsized influence in our lives, and a way to suppress their political influence as well. But from my perspective, there are clear, legitimate policy reasons why the government wants to rein in these companies. The problem here is why is there such a dramatic and sudden shift of regulatory intensity that gives the impression that the whole thing was very political. And I believe that this dramatic regulatory shift actually is deeply ingrained in China's unique political structure, where the regulatory agencies tend to act in tandem with the central leadership, whereas the central leadership, on the other hand, lacks information. So they don't usually act until the last minute when the crisis looms. And that explains, why you always see this kind of very sudden and violent, sudden and intensive shift of policy agenda in China.
Rogier, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I'm not sure to what extent it is a completely dramatic shift. I remember, when we were still able to go to China before the plague, I was in China in 2019, and a number of conversations that I had there with experts and academics already referred to the fact that a head of steam was building in regulatory bodies against these companies. But, the way that this works is you don't really see the head of steam building, particularly when you're on the outside. And it's only really when the pressure reaches the tipping point that a number of things happen at the same time. And you then get what seems like a very dramatic switch, but it's been building over time. And I think there have been a couple of contributing factors, some policy, some personal. Policy-wise, I think the Chinese government has been rather concerned about the potential impact, particularly of and financials activities on credit growth in China. One of the things that Beijing has learned from the 2008 financial crisis is you want to keep the financial system in its box. You don't want it to get out of control and infect the real economy, right? So it needs to be kept within a sphere where it acts as a handmaiden to the real economy, as opposed to becoming a prime venue for capital accumulation in its own right. And so this was one very big reason for the People's Bank of China to intervene in the financial side. But there was also concern about the fact that these companies were just getting too powerful and therefore monopolistic in its own right. And all kinds of problems result from that. Partially, it's not good for consumers, as monopolies tend to be, but partially, you need to see this in the light of China's ambition to become a technology superpower. And one of the things that China noticed, both in its study of the tech industry abroad, as well as in its observation of the domestic tech industry, is that the bigger and the more monopolistic these companies become, the less they themselves invest in R&D, the more eager they are to purchase small emerging startup competitors who might actually be innovative. And so the Chinese government saw this as something that is deleterious, particularly at a point in time where Chinese internet businesses are really seen as members of quote unquote Team China in this enormous effort to gain global technological leadership, particularly in the light of US sanctions. Now that's obviously the policy side. Then you've got the personal side. Jack Ma is one of the most mediagenic CEOs out there. And as the old proverb goes, there can only be one red sun in the sky. And I think Jack Ma flew slightly too close to it on wings made of wax, to mix a metaphor or two.
I mean, John, I'm really glad Rogier raised the question of the real economy, because that's what you look at with your research. You look at sort of the hardware side of things. I mean, is there any prospect of the Chinese government getting these companies to, if you like, invest in the real economy rather than investing in kind of platforms that they seem to distrust?
Well, they already are, Graham. In the case of Alibaba, last year they claimed to have released the world's most powerful computer processor based on the open source RISC-V architecture, for example. So I certainly agree with my two panelists in that, firstly, there are good technocratic reasons for these actions. And of course, we have to put this in global context. There's a global discussion about the negatives of big internet platform monopolies and the need to regulate them. And Europe is more advanced than the United States in this respect. Some of the measures being introduced over here, you might say, I'm actually calling from London at the moment, but if we're talking about the European Union, are more intrusive, arguably, than what's going on in China. And then, of course, one can't discount the political factor. Rogier, I think, has coined the term cyber-Leninism, but that's always the operating principle here, that there is only one ruling powerful authority in China. And certainly based on media reports, I'm going to what Angela said, it really was Xi Jinping's personal displeasure with Jack Ma's speech, which was the trigger here. But as Rogier pointed out, there has been a good head of steam building for this. And if we want to bring it back to the real economy, then you only need to look at what's in the 14th five-year plan, for example, and indeed in Xi Jinping's speeches and other key policy statements, speech by the MWIT director at the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference back in March as well, for example. There is a lot of emphasis on the real economy and the need for the digital platform companies to serve that. And again, if we come back to the idea of Team China, these companies already have the resources to contribute there. They're already developing the next generation computer processors, the cloud architecture. They don't need to expand further in China. Indeed, at this point, you could say that there aren't many productive niches for them left to fill. All that they're doing is building regulatory risk if they continue expanding their operations. So it does make sense from a number of points of view.
And Angela, I mean, your focus for a long time has been on these regulatory bodies that regulate antitrust law in China. And reading your work, I mean, one of the things that's come through right from the beginning is that these bodies are generally pretty under-resourced in terms of personnel and in terms of expertise. But there seems to have been a huge shift that's gone on as a result of what's happened over the last year. I mean, do you think these bodies that have been pretty low-key up until now have the capacity to take on companies that are, capitalized at more than $500 billion? I mean, are a few bureaucrats in Beijing really going to be able to sort of take on these companies and engineer the restructuring?
Well, Chinese regulatory authorities are indeed very resource restrained. And currently in Beijing, the Anti-Monopoly Bureau have around 40 staff members. So that is a very sharp contrast to the EU, the European Commissions, where you have, almost 800 staff, maybe 1,000 now. And whereas in the United States, right, I mean, Department of Justice and the FTC also have over 1,000 staff members. So how could you possibly have around 40, something small bureau to fight against a company like Alibaba? Well, I mean, in the case of Alibaba, this case was prosecuted at a lightning speed. If you look at the previous precedents involving big abuse dominance cases, like the case against Qualcomm, investigated between 2013 and 2015, it takes like about a year or two. And the case against Tetra Pak took 5 years. But this case against Alibaba took only 4 months. And actually, I think the case was done as soon as it was announced, because on the day the agency announced the decision, you observe Alibaba stock prices drop over 13%, which wiped out over $100 billion of its market cap, right? I mean, so and that's deliberately this is carefully planned in advance, because the Chinese agency, because of the resource restraint, and they have been very adept at using media strategy to put pressures on companies and entice them to cooperate with the agency. So this strategic announcement of the investigation is also a way to entice the firms to cooperate. And you see Alibaba immediately reacted that we will actively cooperate. And when the fine and the penalty decision was released, the firm actually thanked the regulator for imposing a $2.8 billion fine, and the market rebounded, right? I mean, because the market predicted even worse from the penalty. I mean, even some have predicted there will be a breakup of the firm, which didn't happen. So the firm expressed gratitude to the agency for imposing a $2.8 billion fine, which is still relatively small and manageable for a company like Alibaba.
And I mean, the people who were hauled in, it was like a who's who of every single Chinese tech company, but there was one notable exception. There was no sign of Huawei being brought to book. Is there any prospect of Huawei facing the same sort of scrutiny and pressure?
Well, Chinese antitrust authorities are very busy, given that they are such a small bureau and facing with so many complaints from various complainants like consumers or competitors, right? I mean, so it depends on first whether there have been a very active complainant against Huawei in China. And second, I believe that even if our Chinese antitrust authority is seldom subject to judicial oversight, meaning that very few parties challenge the agency directly, they are faced with very severe bureaucratic constraint, and that's another important constraint that they face. And the bureaucratic constraint comes from this kind of policy constraints or the formal, the text rules of the bureaucracy. So the fact that Huawei is now a national champion and is truly China's most innovative company does impose constraint on the agency in the sense that the agency does not want to take any regulatory action that is deemed to be in contravention with the national economic agenda. I think that also explains why previously the agency have taken such a lax and tolerant approach in regulating the big tech industry. If you look back in the past 10 years, I mean, there have been numerous complaints in the tech sector. And as Roger and John rightly pointed out, I mean, these tensions have been building up over the years. But there had been like this overriding national economic agenda to encourage entrepreneurship, to trying to grow China's internet economy, right? I mean, the State Council also promulgated the Internet Plus initiative in 2015, and there are numerous guidelines that were promulgated to facilitate this goal. So as a small bureau, within a large market regulator, you do need to align yourself with the overall national economic agenda. And that also explains why they didn't act earlier, right? I mean, so if one day, the central leadership decided it's time for us to regulate Huawei, then I believe that there will be more room for discussion about how to do that with regard to antitrust regulation.
Yeah. Rogier, do you want to add to that?
Well, on top of that, and I think that those are some really valuable insights, I think we shouldn't forget that there's a really big essential difference between Huawei and the other companies, and that is, at least for the moment, all that Huawei does is it makes gadgets that it puts in boxes and ships to consumers. And it doesn't really have a monopolistic position in that regard, right? It's a big, powerful tech firm, no doubt about that. But it doesn't have the 90+% market share that Alibaba and Tencent have in some of their respective markets. So I think it's less of an anti-competition issue, but also when you look at it, the way that regulators came after Alibaba's financial services, it is really politically safe to put stuff in boxes and ship them to consumers in comparison with delivering particular services. Now, this may well change. Next month, Huawei is presenting Harmony OS, its own operating system, which it wants to put on its phones. And the idea is that it wants to go and compete with Android, most notably, in the sense that it will also offer this to other smartphone companies, unlike Apple, which tightly integrates this. Obviously, there have been some comments about how original Harmony OS really is. But the point is, Huawei is now moving into software, and Huawei may well be moving into services. And this is the point in time where Huawei will be getting a lot more consumer data. Huawei will be getting into a lot more activities that have broader relevance than just, as I said, putting stuff in boxes and shipping them to consumers. So that is a point in time where that political calculus may well shift. But in the meantime, in comparison to Tencent and Alibaba, there are far fewer politicized consequences that emerge from Huawei's current business activities.
I mean, Rogier, I'm really glad you raised that point, because this gets to another side of the attack on the tech companies, or the sort of confronting of the tech companies, and it gets to the huge amounts of personal data that they're all amassing. So the second draft of China's, what China calls the Personal Information Protection Law, is out, and it's available for comment until Friday if anyone's inspired to get up there and comment. But what I'm curious about to hear from you guys is this law really about privacy for Chinese citizens? And what will this law potentially do to restrain both the tech companies and the Chinese government? Anyone want to take that one on? Rogier has got his hand up.
Thank you. If I can just give a shout out to some wonderful people that I'm working with at DigiChina. A group of us translated the Personal Information Protection Law, both drafts, and they are publicly available on the DigiChina website. So anyone who feels called upon to comment on it can use our translation if that's useful. You know, the word privacy is a really interesting one because we sort of throw it around as though it might mean the same thing in China as it means here. And that really isn't the case. So I'm coming at it from a European perspective, where after the Second World War, we've come to see privacy as a fundamental right. So it is a right that is vested in me as an individual, where anything that I want to keep private is my entitlement, and I have that entitlement against other private individuals, against companies, and against the state. In China, the notion of fundamental rights doesn't really meaningfully exist within the legal system. It exists on paper, but in reality, it's not quite there. So the Chinese legal system works in a far more instrumental and goal-oriented manner. So the question isn't how do we create a right and protect it? The question is how do we create legal regimes that help us go to where we want to go? That is one thing. So what you see is that the Personal Information Protection Law, there's a second law that is sort of developed in tandem with it, the Data Security Law. They really aren't about creating fundamental rights and protecting them. They're about figuring out the role of data protection within the bigger picture of China's development program, looking towards the horizon to see where China wants to go, and meticulously structuring these relationships in such a way that that works. The second thing is that China actually has a word for privacy, yinsi, but from a sort of legal terminological point of view, it actually is far more narrowly defined in China than privacy tends to be in Europe or the West more broadly. Yinsi tends to refer to information about yourself that you would like to keep confidential. And if you look at its definition in the Civil Code, it talks about, pictures of your house or pictures of the more interesting bits of your body. So these sort of things. It has a lot to do with confidentiality, partially because historically there's a very strong connotation attached of shame. Whereas personal information protection isn't really about shameful information, right? One's email address or one's telephone number isn't really shaming something. It's more about identifiability and user control over how they can be identified by whom. And so the whole point of the Personal Information Protection Law is to rebalance the power that individual users have, particularly vis-a-vis tech companies, to decide how they want to be identified. And that responds to a number of concerns in Chinese society, which have been vast, ranging from concerns about data theft and data-enabled fraud to automated decision-making where it comes to marketing and push notifications, to data trading. There is one short section in the Personal Information Protection Law that talks about government, and as one would expect, that actually is very broadly worded and gives government departments an enormous amount of leeway. Essentially, it says something like, government departments, when collecting and processing data, shall abide by the law and shall get consent from the individual, except where the correct fulfillment of their duties and responsibilities means that this is not possible, right? I'm paraphrasing, but that's pretty much what it says. And partially, that's because, again, the Chinese government is a huge, vast bureaucratic machine, and you really want to meticulously fine-tune which government department gets to do what. Because on the one hand, we're obviously talking about police and prosecutorial services, but on the other hand, we're also talking about the local urban authority who wants to give you a traffic fine because you happen to park your car in the wrong place. And all of that is the government. So what I fully expect, in fact, which is already happening, is that we're going to get a whole raft of administrative regulations coming out with all kinds of schedules and catalogs, which will meticulously define which government department has access to which kind of data and what is the level of consent that they need to get. And we're not really going to get that, or we're going to get one with very wide exemptions for domestic police and security services.
I mean, John, a question for you. I mean, with this law, I mean, what are the bureaucratic drivers behind it? And also, what are the implications beyond China's borders? Like, what implications does it have, say, for the global flow of information?
Well, I think that Rogier has already touched on the Chinese public's displeasure with the use and abuse of their data by the large tech companies. So there is an element of response to public opinion here, I think. It might be worth noting that the companion law that Rogier has mentioned, the draft data security law, also makes extensive provisions relating to the creation of national data markets. So that's interesting given the stereotype that China has a huge pool of data which it can weaponize to overtake the US and Europe technologically. A lot of this stuff is instrumental and is designed towards further developing the Chinese digital economy in the ways that the authorities want. But if we come to the international picture, then it might be worth noting that both those draft laws, the Personal Information Protection Law and Data Protection Law, have extraterritorial provisions, and they also contain provisions relating to reciprocal punitive action against foreign actors which have harmed the interests of Chinese citizens or entities. So I think that that really needs to be borne in mind when we're talking about foreign businesses operating in China, or indeed engaging in interactions with Chinese actors outside China. That this is essentially the same principle that was brought in with the Hong Kong national security law last year, for example, where at least on a literal wording of the clause and its current form, action could be taken against any individual anywhere in the world, potentially, for anything relating to an exchange of data with a Chinese actor. Now, how that plays out in practice, of course, is something that remains to be seen. But among other things, the draft data security law also introduces or makes reference to an export control regime for data related to certain categories of items from China. How that relates to China's new export control unified regime also is not entirely clear at this point. I think that what we can say as a general principle is that the Chinese authorities have been extending increasing regulatory control over cyberspace for the last, let's say, 8 or 9 years in particular, and that this is simply the logical extension of that.
And I mean, your research, Angela, sort of almost has a parallel to this when you looked in antitrust terms at what happens to Chinese companies when they go abroad and try to operate in quite different legislative environments. And one of the arguments you make very strongly is that, and I think it's important for our audience here to hear, is that Western governments, such as Australia, both kind of overreact and underreact, if I can put it that way, in terms of their attempts to manage these companies beyond China's borders. Could you maybe flesh out what you mean by that?
Well, that's a very good question. So, given that Chinese companies increasingly active, like either making investments in overseas market or selling to overseas market, they do run into a lot of antitrust problems. And one of the issues that they have in Europe is how do you define the scope of a Chinese company? And actually, this is a very basic question that is the starting point for any antitrust analysis, because you need, before you do any assessment about competitive assessment, you do need to know, am I looking at this specific company, or am I looking at a broader, China Inc., so to speak. So, and the commission really had a very difficult time trying to figure out what is the boundary of a Chinese firm, given the fact that it appears the Chinese government can exert greater control over its companies, whether we're talking about state-owned firms or even private firms, and now even tech firms, right? I mean, so that does give rise to suspicion among the foreign policy makers about how to define the scope of a company. But the irony is that I said that there is an over-inclusive problem, because the irony is that when you do look at the Chinese market, the companies do compete very fiercely, right? I mean, so it will be an over-inclusive conclusion to say all Chinese companies should be deemed one single firm, because they do, in fact, compete fiercely with each other, including the largest state-owned firms. But on the other hand, if we solely look at the ownership structure of a firm, then you also overlook, there are more informal ways of control over a company. So the fact that ownership may have very tenuous relationship with the actual control the government could have over a firm's business, whereas our usual regulatory emphasis is on ownership, right? I mean, so the commission don't intervene, if this firm is not a state-owned firm, and wouldn't take a different approach in investigating those cases. So that may also lead to an under-inclusive problem, right? I mean, so China does present kind of like a paradoxical target to foreign policymakers, given the pervasive control the government could have over its companies.
And I mean, Rogier, to keep this focus overseas, I mean, in addition to the ownership of Chinese companies, a big concern of Western governments has been around this desire that's been stated in the Made in 2025 document, and also rather more notoriously in Huawei's new IP that it submitted to the International Telecommunications Union. This idea that China and Chinese companies are obsessed with setting standards. I mean, do you think this concern about China looking to control tech standards is a legitimate one?
I think the whole standards thing is something that is very much oversold, and I'm sure John also has a bunch of very insightful ideas on this. I'd just like to talk a little bit about this whole notion of China wants to set standards using new IP as an example. So we have this big concern that, setting the standards really means setting the rules for the internet. And so somewhere last year, there was a report in the Financial Times, which essentially said, Huawei and the Chinese government have a new standard for the internet, and it's going to be rammed down all of our throats at the next meeting of the ITU. It's wonderful scaremongering, but the problem is that pretty much every claim made there is problematic. For starters, the ITU doesn't do internet standards. That's the purview of an organization called the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. So the ITU isn't really going to do that. That's one. Two, the new IP documents that Huawei presented were extremely preliminary, right? Didn't even really contain a lot of strong technical content. Rather it was some basic ideas to start thinking about a new way of building networks, which will be necessary to really support the Internet of Things. And that is something that Huawei is certainly not the only company doing this. There's a broad discussion about, as more and more devices get connected, how do we build more effective local networks to make gadgets talk to each other that really don't need to, say, go beyond my house or beyond a certain geographic scope, because the internet is potentially a worldwide thing, and that may just be too much heavy lifting for that. But then there's the whole idea that the Chinese can just ram this down our throat in about half a year's time, which is nonsense. To give you an example, in the beginning of the internet, we had a standard for routing internet traffic, which was called IPv4. And that was really developed at a point in time where there were a couple of thousand computers connected to the internet. But then the whole thing exploded rather meteorically. And there was a clear speck on the horizon where this particular system would run out of numbers. So the IETF decided to come up with a new standard called IPv6. And IPv6 has longer addresses, which include letters as well as numbers. So at least for the time being, we're good for the number of addresses we have under that new system. The draft for that standard, which was a full-fledged technical specification, was delivered in 1998. In 2011, you had a couple of big websites who started trial running this from a technical test perspective. It was ratified as an internet standard in 2017, right? So it took almost 20 years to get from the point of a first draft of a full-fledged standard, which is already a lot more than Huawei gave us on new IP. It took nearly 20 years to get to the point where everyone agreed that this was going to be a standard. I checked yesterday, Google tracks these things. About a third of visits to Google services yesterday were done using IPv6. So that means that 4 years after the rollout of this new system, it's been taken up by a third of traffic, at least as it pertains to Google. Right? In comparison with those numbers, the notion that China can get this done in half a year with the entire global installed base of technology, which you might need to rip and replace it's just ludicrous, right? I don't know what these people were smoking when they wrote it, but I want some of it. And then there's the whole idea that China can ram this down our throats. And that's not how these organizations work. They work on the basis of consensus. And yes, China's participation has been growing, but China really doesn't have preponderance in any of them, particularly at the senior level. I mean, you could say that Huawei has about 10% of the patents in 5G, in the 5G standard. Depending on how you count it, that may well be true. But that also means that 90% of the 5G standard isn't held by Huawei. So I think with the whole standards thing, we really, really oversell this. But it is wonderful fear-mongering. And if you are, a consulting company or a government that really or a government department that really wants more budget to look into this, it's a perfect justificatory, panicky story.
I mean, John, one thing to sort of slightly readjust this question for you is, the investment by the Chinese government is real. You've got a report coming out soon with Merix on the Internet of Things, which details some quite staggering numbers in terms of China's investment in 5G. So as one example, Shenzhen now has 46,000 5G base stations, which compares to just over 800 in Germany, for example. I mean, what are China's vulnerabilities, and can throwing this sort of money at these projects pay off in the long run? Do you think the Chinese state, just by, if you like, sheer force of money and will, can make up for its technological vulnerabilities?
Well, that really depends on what we're talking about. I mean, it's one thing to rapidly roll out a mature or relatively mature technology like 5G base stations, which you just referred to, but it's quite another to develop the next generation. I mean, Roger cited the example of Huawei having, I don't have the figures at my fingertips either, but around 10% of 5G related essential patents. That's approximately the number, at least based on the Chinese government's own estimates, for 6G patents. And of course, 6G is a lot further down the road, but 90% of the patents are held by entities in the US, Japan, and South Korea at this point. So we really need to keep this in perspective. If we're talking about the efficacy of Chinese industrial policy, whether throwing enough money at the wall means enough will stick that they achieve their goals, I don't know whether this will work for the next generation of digital technologies. In some areas, perhaps, but when we're talking about the most sophisticated and difficult areas, like semiconductors, another field that I'm focusing on at the moment, you could say that the Chinese government is simply setting itself up to waste billions of dollars over the next 10 years without fundamentally changing the industrial landscape. Because in many of these cases, it's the fundamental research and the systems integration which is the challenge, not the funding. Now, you could make a good case that in certain digital tech areas, there indeed has been a dearth of investment. So again, if we're talking about the semiconductor field, having more money available is a good thing, but by itself, it's not going to change the fact that some of these technologies are built on decades of collaborative research among technological leaders in advanced economies. If we were to once more take semiconductors as an example, I think everyone has heard at this point of the importance of the Taiwanese firm TSMC, of the way in which Huawei can't make its own chips but relies on outsourcing to this particular Taiwanese company, which uses a particular machine made by a particular Dutch company, which in fact is a global monopoly. You need the machines from ASML in order to make computer processors used in the latest generation smartphones, for example. No one else can do it, essentially, perhaps Samsung, but just to simplify the discussion, let's say that you require the EUV machine from ASML. That is the result, again, of maybe 30 or 40 years of fundamental research carried out by universities in Germany, in the Netherlands, by the national laboratories in the United States, University of California, Berkeley. Many of the key suppliers are European firms which have been industry leaders for, well, a century, in the case of Zeiss, which provides the lens system, for example. So these are technologies which you cannot simply replicate by making huge pots of money available. As one commentator put it, it's not like the internet platforms where you can simply hire a whole bunch of college graduates to code in C, right? These are decade-long strategic technologies that need a lot of things to come together before you can even build a working prototype, never mind scale it up in a commercially competitive sense with industry leaders who may already control 80 to 90% of the market and reinforce their dominance by working with other industry leaders and by plowing their revenues back into R&D to stay ahead of the Chinese competition. And this, of course, gets to the issue of whether, in fact, imposing more controls on exports of key technologies to China will achieve the desired effect of stunting Chinese progress, or whether it will simply stimulate Chinese industry and the Chinese state to put in the necessary changes to catch up, where so far it's actually been quite easy for them to rely on importing the required technologies and skills from abroad.
Yeah. Angela, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, I mean, I did concur with what John has mentioned, like what the Western country have done on Chinese tech firms, particularly Huawei, ZTE, have already generated a sputnik moment in China, where you see the Chinese government mobilize all sorts of resources and to push up its tech companies. But it's true that it will take decades before China can catch up with those very critical and essential components like semiconductors.
And I mean, John, there's been a lot of talk in this town, particularly about the drums of war in the Taiwan Strait. I mean, is there any way that this semiconductor company could shift the strategic calculus of China and its timetable to reunite or unite Taiwan with the mainland?
Well, if you've read my two-part piece in The Diplomat from before Christmas, Graeme, just wondering, then I think you know my views on that. Co-authored, I should say, with my co-lead on the semiconductor research project that's currently being sponsored by the German government, which Merix is leading. The short answer is I think these issues need to be separated for a whole bunch of reasons that I touched on in my last response. I don't think that even a successful invasion of Taiwan, which is a highly risky enterprise, even over the next 5 to 10 years for China, would solve their semiconductor problem. The semiconductor value chain is highly globalized. TSMC may be the industry leader in cutting-edge fabrication, in making the most powerful computer processing chips, but it relies on technologies that are effectively oligopolized by US, European, Japanese, South Korean companies. Not so much South Korea, in fact, they're more of a competitor to Taiwan, but the principle is that you cannot seize any one link of the chain and expect to be able to make the end product. This is an industry, and this goes for, by the way, for the United States as well and the European Union. There's a whole debate over here, again, I'm talking about Europe in general at the moment, over the need to reshore advanced fabrication, not just because of the supply chain disruptions which have been created by the pandemic, by the drought in Taiwan, and a number of other disruptions over the past 2 years, which have had serious deleterious effects on the auto sector, for example, very important here in Germany. But also because of the need to position yourselves advantageously in future technologies. So there's a lot of talk about digital sovereignty, strategic autonomy in Europe at the moment, and obviously the need to be able to make cutting-edge chips yourself instead of relying on a small island that happens to be on the edge of an earthquake fault zone and has a sovereignty claim to it by a country of 1.4 billion people with the world's second largest military budget across a small stretch of water, has certainly got people's attention. But that doesn't change the economic realities of the semiconductor supply chain. I mean, just to put this in perspective, Intel, which was one of the original Silicon Valley companies, is now struggling to get back into the game, even to compete with TSMC. At the leading edge of semiconductor chip fabrication. To think that the Chinese, again, as Roger put it, can just pull themselves up by their bootstraps and do this within a few years through sheer willpower and large sums of money is unrealistic. And if we come back to the political issue across the Taiwan Strait, I would say that that will be driven by a whole bunch of other factors. The semiconductor industry is not one of them. China's semiconductor sector is still highly dependent on skilled Taiwanese labor, on the role of firms like TSMC in servicing demand. One of the things that has most hurt Huawei over the last couple of years, for example, which has been far more effective, I would say, than all of the huffing and puffing by the former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and the pressure at the political level on other countries not to use Huawei in their 5G networks, has been the export controls by the US Commerce Department targeting indirectly TSMC and through them Huawei's access to cutting edge chips, because there are such bottlenecks, such choke points in the global semiconductor supply chain that the Chinese at the moment are really playing a catch-up game. They need to balance a lot of things carefully if they are simply going to tread water relative to the global leaders. And an invasion of Taiwan, which would scare away the rest of the global semiconductor supply chain, not just from the Chinese-occupied Taiwan, hypothetically, but from China itself, is not going to help them.
So Rogier, to get back to this fundamental question of the relationship between the state and these huge tech companies, earlier this year, the Australian government, possibly not for the purest of motives, attempted to rein in Facebook and Google, and I think by most measures failed catastrophically. I mean, is there something Western governments could learn possibly from China's current campaign to rein in and break up these tech monopolies?
Yes, I think there's a couple of points there, but if you'll allow me, before I get into them, I'd just like to sort of add a little thing onto what John said on the Huawei sanctions, which is that what we are seeing is something really interesting, where in essence, what the United States has done is leverage its control over companies in a globalized economy to essentially deny or imperil the existence of a Chinese competitor. And this may well turn out to be a dangerous precedent exactly for the extraterritorial implications of some of the Chinese technologies legislation that we're seeing, right? A lot of the new laws, including the data security law, contain tripwires that essentially say, you know, whenever a foreign government takes unjustified sanctions against China, we will respond. And this law authorizes the government to respond. Not that the government needs the law, but it's a very clear signal. So I think we should be wary of the extent to which we want to imperil the so-called rules-based global order through essentially deny. Right? It's one thing, what China does is it says there are some goods and services that we don't want on our market. You know, feel free to use them in the rest of the world. We don't want them. What the United States is saying, we don't want Huawei to exist, and we're going to try and kill it stone dead. And we're going to use various means at our disposal to do so. And there's always that risk that, you know, if you do something now for a good reason, 10, 15, 20 years down the line, China might do the very same thing for what we would see as a bad reason. But at that point in time, you've really sort of lost your moral authority. So in the measures that Western governments take, in order to respond to what they see as a China challenge, I would advocate for certainly a measure of farsightedness and prudence. And when it comes to farsightedness and prudence, this is really something that I think Western governments can learn from China. It seems to me that China is becoming, in a whole number of areas related to technology, a little bit of an international thought leader. And the reason that they are is because they very simply have asked very fundamental and very difficult questions sometimes about the role of technology in a society. And they were asking those questions 10, 15 years before we were, right? We were all sort of partying around in our wonderful post-Cold War bliss, where we thought, you know, end of history, liberal democracy plus free market capitalism, we figured it out, we don't need to think about it anymore. Technology symbolized all of that, both the triumph of private sector innovation and, you know, do you remember when technology was going to set us all free and bring democracy to the darkest corners of the world? Oh, those days. China never had that post-Cold War period. So as China started to digitize, a whole number of questions that our government our governments are just now starting to pussyfoot around a little bit, China tackled head on over a decade ago. And we don't necessarily need to agree with China's responses to those questions, for instance, on how you control content on the internet, to recognize that the fact that they asked those questions in the first place put them in a very forward-looking position, in comparison to which, it almost seems to me that we drove our societies like a rental car. So to give one example, China believes that sovereignty in cyberspace should be the fundamental principle on global cyber governance. And put very briefly, the notion of cyber sovereignty is that borders exist in cyberspace as they exist in the real space. Within those borders, national governments have the highest legislative jurisdictional authority. And in order for there to be global internet governance, you in essence need to create a system where all of these governments negotiate rules of the roads, minimum standards, and so on and so forth. For a very long time, the West rather objected to that because they, not without justification, saw this as a defensive effort from the Chinese side to essentially justify the Chinese model with its censorship, with its surveillance, and so on and so forth, where, the West proposed a free, open, and secure internet for the entire world. But in that, no one really addressed the question of how do you deal with legitimate political differences between governments on what should happen in their online space, right? If you don't create an arrangement whereby you can have differing policies on how you govern cyberspace, in essence, what you're saying is we need globally unified rules. And until we have a global democratic order with one world government, that's not really going to be on the cards. And what we're seeing now is that the sovereignty discourse is increasingly being taken over in other countries. The European Union now talks about data sovereignty when it refers to things like the GDPR. It will refer to sovereignty when it talks about the strategic autonomy that it claims to pursue. And so where sovereignty was a very dirty word 5 years ago in Brussels, it's now become fully embraced. And certainly, the US hasn't embraced it rhetorically. But when you look at the things that the United States have been doing, if these are not the acts of a sovereign state, that I don't know what they are. And a similar thing you're seeing in other policy areas. Take a look at, for instance, data security law, which we've already discussed. What the data security law does is, in essence, it says data generated through digital means, whether they are personal or not, may have very important implications on national security and the public interest. And we need to have a regulatory legislative framework in place to deal with that. And this is globally, this is an innovation. I'm not aware of any major digital power right now that has anything in terms of data protection beyond personal data protection, right? Data protection legislation worldwide, as we see it today, nearly exclusively deals with personal information. And obviously you have regimes around things like classified information, but that deals with one very particular subset of government-held information, whereas Chinese data security law recognizes that there are multiple data sets or multiple data categories that might have a major impact on national security, on the public interest, and we should be aware of that. Now, China is the only power who's doing that, to the best of my knowledge, which means that as other countries start confronting that question, particularly third countries that aren't the West or like-minded countries, aren't necessarily allies with China, but China has an answer to a question that very many countries will start to ask, and we haven't. And this is really what we need to learn. We need to abandon our intellectual complacency and be far more audacious than we have been to tackle head-on the difficult questions that the impact of technology on our societies and our economies entail.
Okay, I'm just going to go straight to the wrap-up question now, which I want a very short answer from each of you, starting with Angela. I mean, looking to the next 5-10 years, what does the future hold for the relationship between the Chinese state and these Chinese tech companies?
Well, I mean, this current round of the law enforcement campaign against the big techs will incentivize these companies to further align themselves with the party's interests. And so I believe that these companies will, I mean, as a way of self-protection, will try to do more to enhance the national interest. Maybe to invest more in those foundational science and technology, as some of my panelists have pointed out. And also, we might also expect more wealth redistribution between the platform and the platform participants, like consumers, merchants, delivery drivers, because the increasing aggregation of wealth in the tech sector has also led to all sorts of social problems. So we might expect to see, both the industrial policy and social policy may influence how the tech sector will be run in the near future.
Okay, John.
Well, to come back to Jack Ma, he used to like to say about the tech company's business model that as far as relations with the government went, he was supposed to be in love with them, but not marry them. I think that the Chinese state wants a bit more commitment these days. And this is in line, of course, with the general trend of politics since Xi Jinping took the top job, that the unregulated space, essentially, these companies that we're talking about, the big internet platforms, enjoyed for about a decade and a half is closing. And in future, their relationship with the Chinese state is going for better or worse, depending on where you sit, probably to look a lot more like Huawei's rather opaque relationship with the Chinese state than what we've seen so far. They won't be given the choice, to put it bluntly. And we are going to see increasing control, exactly what the implications of that are, particularly since the Chinese authorities clearly see international integration and connections with the outside world as still a critical piece of this puzzle remains to be seen.
And Rogier, briefly from you.
I've got, I haven't necessarily got a lot to add to what John said. I do think that, that we're entering into a really interesting phase where we're going to see a lot of the mutual dependencies between the companies and the state play out. A couple of years ago, I wrote a paper where I argued that Chinese internet companies and the state had created between themselves a sort of strategic nexus, but where one side would always be more powerful than the other. But we shouldn't forget that these tech companies are hugely important for China, not just internationally because they may generate new sources of export income. They are national champions. They represent China's desire to move up the value chain. But also, if you look at it locally, companies like Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu have been really important supporters for government initiatives, right? So the Chinese government has tried for years to get some more communication going between citizens and government. And hey, presto, suddenly you have social media like WeChat, like Weibo, which still exists. The Chinese government could have never built that itself. But by now, if you look at the number of official Weibo and WeChat accounts, which allow for a modicum of interaction, and particularly on sort of very sort of small local issues like, the local zoo is mistreating its animals, or there are a couple of potholes in my street, in that sense, that really helps with creating the image of a government that can be responsive and solve everyday problems. A lot of government information systems run on technology provided by Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and so on and so forth. In other words, the Chinese government really, really needs those companies to exist and to function well, not just from an economic perspective, but also in terms of harnessing their abilities in the light of China's own e-governance initiatives and the whole idea of the smart state that China is now rolling out. So I still stand behind this notion that what we are seeing is a strategic nexus. But in a way, what's really happening is this is a relationship that has now been redefined, and it's been unilaterally redefined by the most powerful of the parties that doesn't want to kill these companies stone dead, but it wants to signal very, very clearly the boundaries of what they can and cannot do.
Brilliant. Okay, we'll go to Q&A now. I'm going to do it sort of in reverse order because the last question that's come in is a very intriguing one. From Marianne, would the panelists perhaps comment on the big data trading centers? I'm trying to read it with my glasses here. that have been piloted since 2015, given Beijing established its own version just a few weeks ago. Anyone across that?
Perhaps it might be worth clarifying whether you're asking about the pilot systems for cross-border data transfer, which are associated with the high-end services free trade zones around China at the moment. I mean, that's certainly an area of development at the moment. But just to address that quickly, in my closing comments, made the point that the Chinese state is very aware of the need for continued connectivity and compatibility to some extent with the global digital economy. Obviously, the fact that they are trialing pilot zones for cross-border data transfer around the country suggests that they know the trend in the national data governance regime is going to create frictions, at the least, for smooth data exchange with the outside world. And so, as with many things, they're seeking to compartmentalize it, to carve out small areas in which the sorts of companies, we're talking about physical areas here. Shanghai, obviously, would be a good example. It has a number of high-tech development zones concentrating on different things like semiconductors. The sorts of companies that work in these fields will be able to locate in these jurisdictions, which have different cross-border data transfer rules, essentially, so that they can do business more efficiently with the outside world and hence do their thing better. But that doesn't change the overall trend and the situation faced by the vast majority of the Chinese population as far as data controls go. Perhaps Rogier can elaborate on that further.
Well, partially you need to think about the fact that not all data is personal data, and a lot of personal data can be anonymized where it comes to particularly big data processing results. Particularly where it comes to things like industrial control data, things like car performance monitoring and so on and so forth. You know, there's really a lot of potential mileage there, not to issue a bad pun. In order to generate some economic value from that. However, we should also think a little bit about, you know, China. It's a bit of a platitude, but China is not a monolith. And there are a whole lot of crisscrossing logics here where, and this is something we see more broadly in the digital sphere, right? When we're looking at the semiconductor sector, which John elucidated so eloquently. What we're dealing with is an economic sector that has developed in conditions of nearly completely free and open trade in that sector, and has this really optimized towards a business efficiency, which means that this is now a highly efficient supply chain, but in some cases, the word efficiency is a synonym of vulnerability. So it is a very vulnerable supply chain to any disruption, as we're experiencing right now. What China's trying to do is to introduce, and Europe by now as well, the United States, is introduce a separate logic, which is not the logic of economic efficiency, it's the logic of security and resilience. And these are things that cost money. And so we're seeing something similar on data, where some organizations, government departments, businesses, local governments in China want to continue the pursuit of extracting maximum value from what can be done with data, which is good for GDP growth. And so it's achieving one thing of what the government wants. It may support further innovation, which is another thing that the government wants. But you also have this logic of security and resilience, which dictates that we're not going to do some things because they may render us insecure. We are going to duplicate particular capabilities because we don't trust foreign entities with them. And all of these things cost money, either in terms of cash expenditure or in terms of foregone income. And so that's really what we are dealing with. And this is something that we're seeing across the board in the global digital industry, that the logic of economic efficiency and profits only is gradually being replaced by a logic in which security and resilience are becoming more central. That is leading to conflicts, and it's also going to be really expensive.
I mean, to maybe expand on Marianne's question, it reminds me of something that you wrote, Angela, and you wrote in one of your recent commentaries, that Beijing's considering setting up these a kind of an arm's length joint venture company with the domestic tech giants that would oversee the immense amount of data that they're collecting from users. I mean, from these things you've been reading, how would that work?
Well, I mean, they can't actually work unless they change the existing law. But the trend of the existing law, as we talk about those personal information law, do provide very strong protections for consumers. So it seems to me, at least, that it's almost impossible for the government to force these companies to directly transfer the data to a third party if it is not a government agency. Without gaining consumers' consent. So now you see an inherent tension here between competition law and data privacy protection. And I believe the tech firms will try to lobby and trying to seek for protection under the data privacy law, because that's a way of a regulatory arbitrage that they can potentially take advantage of. Because the better protection they have for consumers' privacy, the more protection that they have for themselves to further entrench their monopoly positions.
Okay, the next question I have to ask, otherwise I'll get in trouble when I go home tonight, is from someone called Sarah Logan. Could the panel conceptualize their views on the relationship between big tech and the party state in the context of the 2017 cybersecurity law and the 2017 national intelligence law, especially implementation of measures to compel tech companies to share data with authorities? What does this look like in practice, or and do we even know? Anyone want to have a go at that one? Yep, Rogier.
I'll take it if it's useful. The 2017 cybersecurity law and the national intelligence law really were, to a very significant degree, responses to things like the Snowden revelations, and more broadly, revelations about NSA activities and capabilities where it came to espionage, surveillance, getting access to systems, including in China, and they're only one part of like a really big raft of measures, right? If we see a Chinese drive towards indigenization now, particularly in areas such as operating systems, then that's to a very significant degree due to the fact that Snowden revealed how NSA was exploiting American companies' products like Google, like Microsoft, and so on and so forth. Whether these companies were aware of that is a whole different discussion. But China essentially saw that its reliance on foreign technology created vulnerabilities. And so what it has done since then is a sort of a full spectrum defensive campaign to plug as many holes as possible. By the way, on that, there are also arguments to say that one major supporting factor for the American campaign against Huawei is a very simple fact that it would be much more difficult for the NSA to continue espionage and surveillance activities through Huawei 5G systems than Western 5G systems, given the track record that they have, which that's always a very fun discussion to have. So this is really a sort of a very defensive campaign where what China is seeing, and this, there's a broader siege mentality in Beijing, and it's been there long before Xi Jinping. It really germinated in the aftermath of Tiananmen. But there's this notion in Beijing that the United States is after us, right? Sooner or later, the United States will want to maintain its hegemonic position, and therefore, in the words of a 2011 document under the Hu Jintao administration on culture and ideology, it will continue to exercise a campaign to subvert and fragment our regime and westernize our country. So the overall assessment is the United States is coming after us. And with Snowden and with a couple of other things, with the Trump administration, that perception has only worsened. So there now is a sense that we're nearly in full spectrum conflict in terms of what the United States is doing to us. There have been really interesting reports as well about how the CIA for years has been paying the promotion fees of Chinese party officials, which they had bought, quote unquote. Apparently to rise in the ranks of the Chinese Communist Party, you need to purchase your commission, to use the 19th century British Army term. And the CIA was funding a whole bunch of people who were climbing up the ladder to do exactly that. Now, if this is in public Western reporting, which it is, then we have to assume that the Chinese leadership knows about it as well, and probably knew about it a little bit earlier. So there's this whole broad sense that the United States is using all kinds of more or less overt or covert means to come after us. Through espionage, through surveillance, through peaceful evolution, through increasingly aggressive economic sanction tactics, and so on and so forth. And so what we need to do is counter that. And particularly where it comes to national intelligence law, there's been a fair bit of good public reporting on domestic counterintelligence. What there has been a lot less of is Chinese operations on the ground in other countries, right? We know a bunch of things about cyber operations that emerge from China. What we don't really know is the extent to, or what there's been very little reporting on, is the extent to which the MSS actually has boots on the ground, and to what extent it might leverage, for instance, just for the sake of the argument, Chinese staff in Huawei for that. So that's something that is, for very obvious reasons, not really publicly available information. I hope that helps.
I think so. John, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, maybe just to close the loop on that, and it's worth noting, if we're talking about the CIA, that there's also been public reporting that their networks were rolled up in China some time ago. So I think that also the Chinese authorities have been busy in plugging these holes over the last 7 or 8 years. That, as Roger said, we often look only through the looking glass from one end, right? We read a lot about Chinese cyber espionage conducted against Western companies, but as Greg Austin, who used to be at UNSW, wrote, China's networks have been thoroughly compromised. It's the most compromised network of networks in the world by 2 national governments. One of them is the government of China itself, which seeks complete visibility of what happens in its own cyberspace, including towards its own citizens. And the other is the government of the United States. And if we look at the measures in the national intelligence law, in the cybersecurity law, as Roger said, we do need to see it in that context. That cyberspace, if we were to get into technical military theory terms, as a domain of operations, it differs fundamentally from the domains of the physical world in that it's entirely human constituted. And who has built it? It has been American companies until the very recent past. So in that context, what the Chinese see is a terrain or landscape which has been entirely shaped by their adversary. They actually have a phrase for the US tech majors, Bada Jinggang, which you might have read, referring to the warrior guardians in a Chinese Buddhist temple, which they use for the leading US tech companies, Google, Qualcomm, Microsoft, Cisco, and so on. I think that captures the degree of dominance that they see in American control of the upstream sectors of the global ICT supply chain, the infrastructure through which cyberspace is generated and through which all of data flows. And that is the stem for the import substitution campaigns, for the I think it's the 352 program, for example, which aimed for complete substitution of major ICT contracts with domestic suppliers by this year, 2021, as well as regulatory measures such as the two laws that we've been talking about. This is really defensive in nature, and it may be difficult to get your head around that as a consumer of Western media, because again, we only see ourselves as on the receiving end. But again, everyone is a hero in their own story, right? As far as the Chinese authorities are concerned, here all they are doing is protecting themselves and the political system which they have defined, whether we agree with the principles on which it's built or not, against hostile foreign interference. Now, that said, there are significant implications, as I mentioned before, for foreign actors trying to do business with China in a completely apolitical sense, because of some of the provisions which are now being included in drafts such as the Personal Information Protection Data Security Law. But perhaps I'll leave it to Angela to close out this topic, and we can address some of those other aspects a bit further on.
No, I don't.
If you like, Angela, or I can. The one that's been here from the beginning is the cryptocurrency one. I don't know if you want to take that one on. I'll just read it out quickly. ECNY Digital Yuan, backed by the Chinese Central Bank, a new development encouraged by China. Given the recent ban or distrust of certain cryptocurrencies which are inherently decentralized, I think it's more of a statement. How does China navigate the risks from digital decentralization compared to control gained through centralized intelligence? Does it also speak to other areas of the digital economy? All right. Who wants to have a crack at cryptocurrency? Rogier.
Yes, I think the first big point that we need to make is that the digital yuan is not a cryptocurrency. It's digital currency, right? The difference between them being that a cryptocurrency is a monetized or money-like token generated through a particular digital process that isn't overseen by what we would traditionally see as an issuer of money, which usually is National Central Bank. So we're not really dealing with a cryptocurrency. Rather, so the whole idea behind cryptocurrencies, or at least that's what the Bitcoin boys tell me on Reddit, is that this is a hedge against inflation because you can't trust national banks because they've been debasing the currency with over a decade of quantitative easing. And so, Bitcoin is decentralized and other coins are decentralized. So you don't have, and yada, yada, yada. So the idea of Bitcoin and all of the other coins, Dogecoin and what have you, really is to be an alternative to state-issued currencies. That's the problem that they're trying to solve. What the digital yuan tries to solve in terms of problem is more of a problem in the controllability of particular money-related processes, right? The illegal economy, tax avoidance, and so on and so forth, but also to a very significant degree, the traditional banking sector. Now, the traditional banking sector has been really, really bad at developing products and services aimed at consumers. They've really been much more transmission belts for large state capital investment in big enterprises, big infrastructure plans, and so on and so forth. This is really what created the space for things like Alipay and Tenpay to come into being. Now, when you have a digital yuan, what you could do, and there are already trials on this ongoing, is just create digital wallets and bypass the entire traditional banking sector if you want to sort of deal with individuals, right? You might well do if you want to do quantitative easing, rather than having to do it through the traditional financial system, you might well deposit a couple of thousand yuan into every citizen's digital wallet with the instruction to go out and buy yourself something pretty. So I think we're really talking about, two different species of animals here, and they might be both mammals in the sense that they resemble each other, but I think none of us would easily confuse a dog and a dolphin.
All right, I think we have time for the final question, which I'll take from Natalie, who asks, Could the panel touch on the scientific data administrative measures that were issued in the summer of 2018? I got to say, I can't add much to that one, but can any of you guys?
I'm afraid I haven't looked at them in detail.
John? We stumped our panel and Angela's looking. But in that case, we'll go to Waka's question and maybe leave that as homework for the rest of us. Waka asks very simply, is China going to be an alternative of US in advanced tech? Very straightforward question. I guess it's almost a yes or no question.
And as any academic, I will answer by saying that it's both yes and no. Certainly, you know, when you look at it from the perspective of something really interesting, but we haven't really mentioned it yet, the digital Silk Road. Full disclosure, we've got a report coming out in the next couple of weeks on the recipient country view on the digital Silk Road. And one of the things that really came up, particularly in a couple of smaller Asian and African countries, was this sort of notion that they don't necessarily want to end up in a very close relationship with China, but they see it as really beneficial that there is more competition between the US and China, because that, they hope at least, that puts countries like them in a position where they can get a better deal from both, right? They're keeping each other a little bit more honest because, you know, neither of them is the only game in town. More broadly, you really need to look at this at a case-by-case basis, right? We know that China, for instance, is fairly far where it comes to things like quantum computing at a sort of advanced technology level. Does that matter for, you know, consumer electronics today? Not yet. It may well do so a couple of years down the line, but at the moment, this is very much, you know, sort of like Project Apollo. It's very beautiful to look at and it gives you a lot of prestige, but it isn't necessarily impacting individual lives on a daily basis. But where I think we really need to think about these things long and hard is not in our own markets, but it's in the markets of what managers and management consultants like to call the next billion. So what we are used to is the Apple model. And I say this as someone who just yesterday pulled the trigger on one of their new iMacs with their new highly advanced M1 chips, right? If we're going to be working from home, you might as well have a decent computer to do it on. But the Apple model is to have really advanced technology packaged in a very slick, attractive package, but you also sell it at a fairly high cost. But if you compare that with Huawei, who also, you know, they have high-end lines, but they also have really cheap lines that have a very significant degree of the functionality. And when it's about connecting the next billion, right, those people in Asia, in the Middle East, in Africa, where a middle class is emerging, who are starting to generate the income that they need to get a smartphone, they don't need all of those advanced functions, right? For them, the iPhone that we would have had 5, 6, 7 years ago, and whose performance you can now offer at a package costing under $100, is more than good enough. So at that point in time, you're going to see Chinese companies, particularly in developing countries, looking at these emerging global middle classes. They're not competing on features. They are competing on cost and a total package. And that may well be an alternative way of doing business that's going to be really interesting. More broadly, I think we need to really keep at the back of our minds that because these big Chinese tech companies grew up in an environment with a lower standard of infrastructure, far fewer existing supporting ecologies like payment, a government that can be capricious, a population of market consumers who aren't necessarily the wealthiest. Those are the conditions that they developed in China, and those are the conditions that they will meet in developing countries as they internationalize. In other words, Chinese companies may well be in a more experienced position to get into this next billion than many Western tech companies are.
That's a great answer. I think we're just about at time. For my part, I'd just like to say Angela and Rogier and John, thanks for joining us. And I'll pass over to Sarah to wrap up.
Great, thank you so much, Graeme, and thank you to Rogier, John, and Angela. I don't have much to add except to say that I hope that our discussion tonight has added a really useful level of detail and nuance to this often, or sometimes, frantic debate about Chinese tech. I can't thank you enough for sharing your expertise with us and for giving us your time when I know you're also busy, especially across multiple time zones. We'll be sharing with our audience, we have already shared with our audience a basic bio of yours, and we'll be sure to share with them your latest publications as they come out. I know that Angela, Rogier have books coming out or out already, and John, you have a new report coming out as well. So thank you all so much, and thanks to our audience for attending today at what is a slightly difficult time in Australia, sort of the end of the day, and for asking useful questions. Thanks so much. I look forward to seeing you all at the next seminar in this series.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.